Swinson.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I say what a pleasure it is to follow the Honourable Lady. I particularly enjoyed her remarks about the American elections, which I have also been following with much interest. I think my overriding concern is that it's either Obama or Clinton in the White House next time, and we'll be very pleased to see the back of the current occupant. But I have to confess that, faced with the choice between the two, then I also am a bit of a supporter of Hillary. On her comments on ageism, I do share her abhorrence of this practice, but as the youngest member of this House, I would just point out it does work both ways. Mr Deputy Speaker, first of all, I must apologise on behalf of my honourable friend for Hornsey and Wood Green, who would normally speak for my party on these issues. She has a prior constituency commitment, but I am delighted to be able to speak in her place on this debate to mark International Women's Day. Yesterday we had a wonderful cross-party event just outside Parliament to pay tribute to Emmeline Pankhurst, obviously in terms of the suffragette movement. I did note it was a bit of a shame that the nearest that she managed to get to a statue in Parliament was actually outside it in Victoria Tower Gardens, but nonetheless it was a very enjoyable event, and indeed welcome to see very many men there also celebrating it, one of whom, the Honourable Member for Braintree, is in the Chamber at this moment. It's a particularly appropriate time to have this debate, not just because it's International Women's Day, but because the year 2008 has very many anniversaries. It's 90 years since women achieved the right to vote, and it's 80 years since women achieved the right to vote on the same basis as men. And when thinking about history, I would just like to share with the House what I always say to constituents is my favourite part of the tour of the House of Commons, which is a marble statue in the approach to Central Lobby. I don't really know the background to the gentleman the statue is of, but clearly he was deemed to be worthy of a statue in the House of Commons when Emmeline Pankhurst was not, but he's apparently the second Viscount Falkland, who obviously had some importance. But what attracts me to this part of the tour is not actually who the statue is of, but it's the little sort of crack mark along the sword which he is holding. He's got both hands clasped on a sword which goes down to the marble base of the statue. And the reason that crack is there on the sword is because on the 27th of April 1909, one Marjorie Hume, also in the suffragette movement, handcuffed herself to that statue, and the only way that they could remove her was actually by breaking the sword in the statue. And I noticed that as my most favourite part of the tour, because I actually appreciate when standing there to actually think, nearly 100 years ago, as part of the suffragette movement, this was where a piece of history took place. I'll certainly give way to the Honourable Lady.
Does the Honourable Lady know that I understand that they had to break the statue because they didn't have a blowtorch, and after that, because they were worried about further demonstrations, the order went out to go and buy a blowtorch so that they could break the chains rather than the valuable statues?
I thank the Honourable Lady very much for that intervention and a further piece of information about that event. Now, representation of women, I would argue, is important in itself. It's important for equality and fairness in a 21st century society. I also happen to think it's important for the credibility of this chamber in the eyes of our constituents when they turn on the television, as they may occasionally do, to watch the goings-on here. I think it doesn't do politics a service when they see that there is such a lack of diversity in the House. And I would say that actually in terms of not just gender, but in terms of age, in terms of background, in terms of ethnicity, and many other elements of diversity. But I think it is also important to note that having a better representation of women also does change the issues which get discussed. And I would very much recommend to honourable members a book by Boney Soanes and indeed the honourable member who is in her place from Luton South, which is an excellent book called Women in Parliament, and it chronicled the interviews of many women MPs, and I actually read it just a few months after getting elected and found it contained quite a few tips. I also found pleasingly that some of the experiences that women elected in 1997 had gone through of really quite extreme and awful cases of sexism even within this chamber, Mr Deputy Speaker, certainly did not relate to my experience coming in 8 years later in 2005. So I'm pleased to see that there has been some really good progress in this House in terms of the way women are treated. But what that book also found was that there had been a noticeable change in some of the the issues which had been discussed as a result of having more women in the chamber. Now, we have heard very many issues already raised today: trafficking, women in prisons, armed forces, child poverty, carers, forced marriage, issues to do with BME women, and these are all important, but time is limited for this debate, and it is of course impossible for me to cover everything, and I do believe that if more speakers are able to contribute, that will make for a more interesting debate. So I intend to confine my remarks to a few areas of issues which particularly affect women, which are equal pay, violence against women, pensions, the international dimension, and indeed women's representation. I certainly will.
For that plug, which I wasn't anticipating, but could I also thank her for the support that she's given to the follow-on project that myself and Bonnie Stones have been involved in, Women's Parliamentary Radio, in which we can unmediated have information about women in Parliament and what we are doing, rather than the stereotypes about women in this place that are often promulgated in the media.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention. She's absolutely right. The Women's Parliamentary Radio project is an excellent one, which deserves support. And I don't know if Hansard do URLs, but I think it's www.wpradio.com, or it might be .org, in fact. But I would certainly encourage honourable members to be involved with this as an excellent project. Turning to the issue of the pay gap, which the Minister in her opening remarks did accept is still a problem, I do believe it is simply shocking that 30 years, more than 30 years after the Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination Act, we still have a significant pay gap between men and women, 17% of the mean for full-time workers, and indeed amongst part-time workers it's as high as 35%, which is particularly worrying because there are so many more women working part-time as a percentage than men. The current way of dealing with equal pay claims does seem to be, frankly, not working. In the year to the 1st of April 2007 alone, there was 130,000 claims made under the legislation. The Equal Opportunities Commission, before it was wound up, pointed out the great problems that there were in the time it was taking for cases to be heard, which is understandable given the volume of them. And so effectively the legislation is not managing to tackle the issue. I think pay audits are a good proactive way to deal with the issue, and in the public sector this is now common practice, but I for one would like to see this extended to the private sector. We do have the gender equality duty, but I think we should be requiring private companies to undertake pay audits, and in fact as a quid pro quo say to them, if you uncover problems during that, then we won't have claims made against you for that, as long as you redress the situation and put that right. Certainly give way to Honourable Friend.
Thank you for giving way. Would she accept that it's actually in the best interests of companies to provide this information, because all the evidence is from those companies who do that they get better women applying for jobs as a result of it. So it's a win-win situation, really, win for women and win for the companies.
Absolutely. My honourable friend makes an excellent point, of course, and I think indeed the Right Honourable Lady for Maidenhead pointed out that businesses are increasingly recognising the different skill set that women bring to an organisation, and in fact the complementarity of having teams which have a mix of men and women in them. So I do believe pay audits are important to help tackle the issue of equal pay. I'll certainly give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving away, and I agree with her on the point of mandatory pay audits. She mentioned the number of equal pay claims that are currently being brought, and of course many of those claims are being brought in the public sector. Would she agree with me that one of the problems is the equal pay legislation was effectively ignored for many, many years, and it's only really within the last 10 years that this issue is really being addressed in any way at all?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. I think I did read a quite shocking statistic about the whole team that is set up just to deal with claims from the NHS, and the thought that even within our public services this issue is not being addressed, and government services are actually part of the problem rather than part of the solution is certainly very concerning. I also think in terms of equal pay we do have to look at the issue of childcare, and I would propose, in fact, in terms of this issue, that we should actually allow maternity leave to be shared between fathers and mothers as they choose, as they see fit. Currently, fathers, could be said, get quite a raw deal in terms of only getting a short period of paternal leave, but I think actually also this helps to reinforce discrimination against women, because an employer who is interviewing a woman of childbearing age in their late 20s, early 30s is perhaps sitting there and thinking in the interview, will this this member of staff that I might employ end up leaving for parental leave, maternity leave purposes, but they wouldn't necessarily think the same thing about a man in that situation. So I actually think that by sharing the parental leave, not only would more choice be given to parents about actually how they want to manage that childcare, but that would also help tackle some of that indirect discrimination, which is actually very difficult to prove and very difficult to deal with through legislation. I also believe that I will give way, and I do want to make some progress.
I don't understand that, because I think, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think there is broad agreement in the House for what she's saying about more that could be done to equalise pay. But I think one of the things that was quite shocking when we were looking at women in work as a commission, as part of the Select Committee, was taking a particular cohort, instead of taking the whole population and saying what the gap is, taking women graduates and comparing them with male graduates, just 5 years out of university. Now, one would have thought in that group there would be a reasonable expectation that the pay gap wouldn't even exist, let alone be very big. And yet it was still 15% just 5 years down the road. And so I do worry just how intractable the gap in pay is going to be to do something about.
Indeed, and this issue is very concerning. I think there is another issue also, which is, in my experience in working in the private sector, I have to say you got a pay rise if you asked for it, and only if you asked for it and negotiated it. And as the Honourable Lady says, from a sedentary position, the boys do, and they, in fact, from an early age through social conditioning, are encouraged to speak out, even to shout out in class. Boys are less likely to be disciplined for that, whereas girls be a good girl, but boys will be boys. There is a sort of inbuilt discrimination, which I suspect to a certain extent we're all guilty of within society. And I think that partly this could be addressed through education, but that's why also the pay audits and companies having a requirement to be proactive about the issue and actually check there is equality is going to be so important. I also think on the issue of flexible working, I welcome the commitment the government has made to extend it to parents of older children, but I would actually go further and say that we need to change the mindset and the culture of work in this country. And obviously businesses need to be able to make decisions based on business reasons, but why shouldn't everybody have the right to request flexible working? After all, it's only the right to request flexible working, not the right to demand it. So if everybody had the right to request it, then we might actually start to change the culture, and it can be in business's interest, because if one member of staff wants to come in early and leave early, and another member of staff wants to come in later and leave later, they may actually, if they're in a customer-facing business, be able to actually be open for a longer period of time. Turning to the issue of violence against women, which is, frankly, a scourge on our country and the world, I'd like to pay tribute to the great work of the End Violence Against Women Coalition, which has done great things to highlight this issue. The shocking statistic that almost half of all women in the UK at some point in their lives will face domestic violence, sexual assault or stalking is frankly unacceptable. Now, I will accept there has been much progress in the last few years, and the Labour government has actually addressed some aspects of this issue with the specialist domestic violence courts, sexual assault referral centres and so on. But there is still a huge amount that needs to be done. And in fact, recently, the End Violence Against Women Coalition found that 1/3 of local authorities have no specialist violence against women services. Rape crisis centres are closing in increasing numbers, and surely this needs to be going in the other direction. The recent report Map of Gaps highlighted Scotland as a case to be followed, as a good example, because what Scotland had done was actually to ring-fence this funding for support for women's services. And as a Scottish member, I was particularly pleased to read about that, and that's why it is with great disappointment that I have to inform the House that the recently elected government, SNP government in Holyrood, has actually reversed that pioneering and forward-thinking move, and in fact in the recent local funding round has stopped the ring-fencing of violence against women and women's aid services, so they'll be rolled up into the general local government settlement, and when pressure comes under budgets, I have great fear that some of these services will be cut.
The Honourable Lady, I'm sure for the sake of completeness, will confirm that the local government settlement is much bigger and that there's every intention every one of those services will continue to be provided. I'm sure she'll do that for the sake of completeness. Well, there's certainly no guarantee,
and when the funding was ring-fenced, then it did have to be spent on those services. It will now be up to decision-making, and there is great pressure on local authority funding within Scotland. Councils are having to make very difficult decisions because effectively they've been blackmailed into providing a 0% council tax rise, and as a result there are very difficult decisions being made, and I have great concerns that some of these important services will be cut.
Well, Lady, give way on that point. In my constituency, there's a 3% cut in local government funding, and Women's Aid is one of the organisations that's being cut. So I think the point that she's making is a valid point that I know is being experienced in many parts of Scotland.
I welcome the additional information the Honourable Lady provides about her area, and I know she'll be very concerned about the cuts to those services. What I would say, however, is missing, and it's what the Violence Against Women Coalition is calling for, is a cross-departmental approach to this issue. We need to recognise that violence against women is not just about the very often excellent Department for Women and Equalities. It is not just about the health service providing the support when women have been victims of violence, or indeed the justice system that deals with it. It's not just about safe transport for women. It's not just about education to try and prevent some of this. All of these departments need to be working together. And I have to say, I actually, on the 25th of January 2006, questioned the then Prime Minister on this issue in Hansard column 1425. And I asked him if he would therefore commit to developing an integrated strategy on this issue. And I have to say I was somewhat disappointed by his answer, because his answer related solely to victims of domestic violence. And the whole point I was making was that violence against women is not just about domestic violence, it's much wider than that. The government was given 1 out of 10 in the first year by the coalition in its report on these services. It was given 2 out of 10 in the following year. I do hope there will be continued progress, but I actually also wanted to ask if the Minister, perhaps in her summing up, will be able to report further on this issue, because I raised it again in July 2007, on the 17th of July, when there was a statement from the Minister for Women, and she said, from column 183, we are considering merging the Interministerial Group on Domestic Violence and the Interministerial Group on Sexual Offences in order to take an overall view across government on violence against women. This would be very welcome indeed, but that was in July, and I would like to ask if some months on this has happened, or what the status is of that. Particularly on the issue of violence against women, I wanted to raise the issue of rape, and I in fact have an early day motion number 765 down on this, called Campaign for Justice for Victims of Rape, which 84 honourable members have already signed. The conviction rate, as we all know, for rape is appallingly low, at around 5%, which is down from 33% in the 1970s. Now, this is not the conviction rate for cases that actually get to court, because more than 4 in 5 cases don't get to court, and so the problem is not necessarily at that jury stage. The problem tends to be much earlier on in actually cases being dropped and not sufficient evidence being collected. I know the Minister who was here earlier the government has been consulting on this issue, and that's certainly to be welcomed, because we do need to review how we can improve criminal practices to ensure that more cases do get to court and are successful. But I think it is also important that the support services do get stable funding, because that can actually be really important for whether or not a woman will actually pursue a case, or whether the woman will in fact decide to drop it or not report it at all. I think we do also need to address the myths about rape. And there's been some really shocking reports done about what actually is the perception out there. In 2005, an ICM poll found that 1/3 of British people thought that a woman in some circumstances could be held partly responsible if she was raped. This absolutely has to be scotched, because it is not a woman's fault if she is raped. It is not her fault if she's been drinking. It's not her fault depending on what she's wearing. We wouldn't say that if somebody was murdered or if they were mugged that it was their fault because of some way they had acted, and we should not do the same for rape. The Right Honourable Lady from Maidenhead mentioned one of the horrifying statistics earlier about the number of young girls being pressurised into sex, and 40% of young people, a recent Amnesty study showed, know girls whose boyfriends have coerced or pressurised them into sex. I mean, this is, in a sense, shocking, but actually in some cases not all that surprising when you think about what education is currently provided and the different views about sex which are allowed to be developed between boys and girls. We absolutely need to tackle this issue from an education point of view, so that it's very clear what is acceptable behaviour and what is not acceptable behaviour. I actually questioned the Minister for Schools, Children's Schools and Families about this in December, 17th of December, Hansard column 584. And the point I was raising was that it wasn't just sex education that was important, but relationships education has to be absolutely integral part of that. When young people are learning about how to have safe sex, about the biology of sex, about what happens, they also need to understand the context of the relationships in which that can happen and the issues of consent and love and confidence that go with that. I don't see how the two can be separated. And so I was very disappointed when I asked the Minister if he would consider making it a statutory requirement. He said, sex education is statutory, but the relationship side is not. And then he proceeded to say that he wanted better sex and relationships education, but wouldn't actually make that commitment to make it a statutory requirement. I think the government actually, if it does want to get serious about this, needs to look at that issue very, very carefully. In addition, I think we need to look at the issue of women's pensions. Now, the government, give it its due, has made some progress on this issue, particularly for those with caring responsibilities who do not have a complete national insurance record. But the way that it's being done means there will be a cliff edge where women who are eligible for this after the 6th of April 2010, compared to a woman the day before who is not eligible, the difference in what they are entitled to will be £27,000 over their lifetime. And I still think the government should have considered doing this in a more staggered way so there was not such a cliff edge. And also, in fact, to look at the issue of a citizen's pension, because even so, it will still be a requirement to have 30 years of national insurance contributions for a full pension. And I think we need to recognise that if some women, even with that 30-year change from 39 years, will still not achieve a full pension because of their caring responsibilities, this does need to be taken into account. There's another issue which has been very much raised by my honourable friend, the member for North Avon, about women who have gaps in their pension record, which they could actually pay to be filled. And there was a particular 6-year period where the government didn't actually inform women that they could do this. Women can do this retrospectively, and in some cases be eligible to a lump sum of a couple of £1,000s or more, plus an enhanced pension going forward. I've tried to raise awareness of this issue in my constituency and help women in individual cases on this, but I think the government should be taking a responsibility to be proactive about making sure that these women get what is actually rightfully theirs. On the international agenda, I think it is very important, after all this is International Women's Day, we are celebrating, to look at the issues that women face around the world. We have countries where female infanticide is very common. As has already been mentioned, there are 2 million girls every year have to go through the appalling practice of female genital mutilation. We have rape being used as a weapon of terror, and we saw it in Rwanda, and yet now, even as I speak, in Darfur, the same thing is happening again. We have women being oppressed in societies and countries across the world, unable to access education, unable to have equal rights in judicial procedures, and indeed also poverty. It tends to hits women the hardest. And indeed, this week there is an excellent exhibition in this house in the upper waiting area about the impact of climate change on women, and in fact it is also women that will feel the effects of climate change the hardest in the developing world. Although, interestingly, as the Right Honourable Lady from Maidenhead said, very often women can also be the solution, even though they are also suffering the worst elements. There is a very high correlation between the education of women in countries and how developed that country is. We see microfinance initiatives that women are running to make their communities better all across the world. And this government, through its international development work, I think should rightly make sure that it makes a priority in involving women in being the solutions to many of these problems in their countries. And that brings me, Mr Deputy Speaker, to the overall issue of women's representation, which I suppose brings all of these different issues together. We have in this House at the moment 126 women members of Parliament, fewer than 1 in 5, which is clearly not enough. In some of the other authorities and parliaments, it's slightly better. The Scottish Parliament, it's a third, although sad to say that's actually down from 40% previously. The Welsh Assembly, as we've heard, is an excellent record at 47%, and I congratulate the Welsh Assembly on achieving that. The European Parliament is 31%. But even in local authorities, although it's better than this House, 29% councillors, and I have to say I'm delighted the Liberal Democrats at 32% of the highest percentage of women councillors, but we have no reason to be complacent. And sometimes when you're in meetings with people and you say this is a problem, men will turn around and they'll go, oh, a third woman, that's quite good. And you say, no, hang on a second, it's maybe quite good compared to the really awful representation in other areas, but there is no way that a third representation of women is good. I think you could probably just about on statistics say 47% is quite good. You're not always going to get exactly 50-50, but we cannot be complacent when we do reach a third. And I know, the Labour benches do have many more women, and I hope there is no complacency there, because even on those benches there is still a long way to go. I think we need to look at the reasons as to why this representation is so low. There's a variety. Is it sexism? I think it probably is partly sexism, but I don't think that's the only reason. And I also think it's less likely to be the reason to be sexism now than it was 30 years ago. Certainly, we know that the electorate is no less likely to vote for a woman. In fact, I've seen research that says not only does the turnout go up when women stand, but that women actually are marginally more likely to be elected than men. So it's an advantage to have women candidates. So if the electorate is no longer sexist, I think it would be slightly strange to suggest that political parties had a higher degree of sexism. So while that is still probably a factor in some cases, it is not the only one. Is it the lifestyle? Is it that women look at us debating till 11 o'clock at least 2 nights so far this week, and there's sometimes strange procedures and practices of this house, and perhaps entirely sensibly say, hang on a second, that's not for me. I can make an impact in another career, in business, in one of the professions, or indeed working in my local community. I suspect that has also some role to play. But that also wouldn't explain the low percentage of councillors, because actually combining the lifestyle of a councillor with many other sensible things one might want to do is much easier, I suggest, than combining the lifestyle of a member of Parliament with 2 lives and 2 homes. I think certainly cash is part of the issue. The financial situation, when we have the pay gap, that exacerbates the problem with representation. Let's be honest. Standing for Parliament, being involved in politics, there are additional costs that come from that, whether it's in making sure, because like it or not, as the Honourable Lady mentioned, women do get judged on their appearances more, and so there are wardrobe costs and so on. There's certainly childcare costs, but also just going to party conferences, accommodation, the little things which happen all of the time as a candidate. Taking your volunteers out for a drink after a hard day's work. There's a lot of incidental costs which do contribute, and because there is a pay gap, this makes it even worse for women. But another issue I think is a real problem is confidence. And I noticed with interest, one of my most favourite things about the job is going and speaking to school groups, because rather than being deferential, they'll always tell you exactly like it is, and be very inquisitive and enthusiastic. But when I go and speak to a school group and ask for questions, 9 times out of 10, the first question is from one of the boys. And very often the second question too. And there have even been occasions when I've had to turn to the class and say, come on girls, you must be thinking interesting things too. Why don't you put your hands up? And then, fair enough, some of them do. But I also recognise that, and I don't know whether other women and male members in this chamber do. I remember the feeling of sitting in a room or in a political meeting or in a classroom and thinking something in my head and thinking, shall I say that? No, I might look stupid. And you have this sort of internal conversation and you decide it's just safer not to put your hand up and not to contribute. And then, of course, some bloke says the same thing, far less eloquently, and everybody lauds them for it. And it's only through sort of making myself do that, and indeed others helping me to have the confidence, that I got into a position where I felt happy to stand for Parliament. And I didn't wake up one morning and think, I want to be an MP. Other people suggested the idea to me, and I've done a straw poll of my female colleagues in the Liberal Democrat benches. And around about half of the Liberal Democrat women in this place similarly were asked by somebody else. Somebody else suggested it. Now, I haven't done a scientific poll with the male members of Parliament, but I suggest that it might be a slightly different issue. So I would urge all honourable members who want to see more women in politics to make sure that rather than just expect women to magically think they're going to do it, actually say to somebody, why don't you put your name forward? Why don't you do it? Even if they don't want to, they'll be very flattered anyway to be asked. So I certainly will.
I'm inspired by what she's saying, and I'm sure many young women will be inspired by the way she's putting over her points. Most of my colleagues would have been in meetings where they felt exactly the same. I was advised by a Labour politician that I should feel the fear and do it anyway. And I think if you tell that, if the Honourable Lady tells that to the women she's speaking to, I think that will go a very, very long way.
I think that's certainly very good advice, and it's certainly a tactic that I would urge others to employ. So I think these are some of the barriers that women do face, and I would like to acknowledge actually the progress that the Labour Party has made on this issue in electing many more women to Parliament. I think it would be churlish not to, frankly. I do disagree that all-women shortlists have to be the solution for every party, but I would say that I would certainly support an extension of the sunset clause in the Sex Discrimination Electoral Candidates Act until 2030, or frankly until the issue is no longer an issue, because I do believe parties should have the opportunity to use that as one of the tools to deal with the issue. But I would disagree that it's the only tool to deal with the issue. I think if the issue is sexism in the selection process, actually I can think of very few other things which will actually change the outcome. But if that is not what the main problem is, then it's not necessarily the right solution. And I speak from several years of experience dealing with this issue in my own party, and we looked at the figures and did the research. And what we found was if we actually took the statistical numbers, women were as likely to get selected in seats, winnable and otherwise, as men. The problem was we had about 5 times as many men coming forward to be candidates as women. And when you're working with those numbers and those inputs, it's going to be a really sort of statistical anomaly if you did end up with a gender-balanced situation. Now, as I say, we've been working on this since the conference debated how to do it in 2001, and I actually chair the Liberal Democrats' campaign for gender balance, which is the approach that we have taken. And we have increased and encouraged more women to come forward. It's still about 3 times as many men as women wanting to be candidates, but that certainly is some progress.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I've enjoyed listening to her analysis, but I do disagree with the last point she's made, because our experience in the Labour Party was that when we had shortlists of half men and half women, it was still the men that won.
Well, and that may well have been the case in the Labour Party. As I say, I haven't done the analysis for the Labour Party. I haven't done the research for the Labour Party. I did the research within my own party. And what we found, that when it was half men and half women, half the time the men won, half of the time the women won. I'm not going to stand here and say there was never any instant of sexism and that there's never been a sexist comment made in Liberal Democrat selection campaigns. Although equally, I would say that in my experience, for every person that said, "Oh well, you know, what would you do if you had children?" or "Oh, are you sure you can do this?" there's been someone else that has said to me, "Actually, I think it's great to have more women in Parliament, and I'm going to vote for you because of it." So I think that the issue can even out, but I wouldn't speak for other parties. I do not know, obviously, the internal procedures and cultures of the other party as well as my own. I would just say that each party should be entitled to find its own way to deal with the issue, and given that our issue is encouraging more women to become candidates, and we have very good support mechanisms in place to help them through that, and indeed to help them win selections, because given that, as I outlined, we still have many more male candidates than female candidates, what we also have to achieve is that those women actually punch above their weight and are more likely to get selected. And one of the things that we do is very intensive mentoring and training. In fact, 2 weekends ago, we had our now annual event called the Future Women MPs weekend with 15 women who came along, and I have to say was very inspiring, and I hope to see many of them on these benches in future. But equally, I think, and I wanted to just refer to some of the issues perhaps at the start of this debate, because we have seen quite a lot of firsts recently, and not just recently, over the last few decades. And one of those firsts, which was an important first, was the election of the first UK female Prime Minister in 1979. And I have to say I was surprised and disappointed that it seemed as if honourable members on the Labour side couldn't even recognise that achievement. Now, I share many of their concerns about what Baroness Thatcher did in office. I certainly don't think, and I speak also as a Scot here, that she necessarily was good for the country. But I can still recognise that that was an important achievement, and does deserve to be recognised, as indeed many of the achievements more recently of Labour women, the first woman Speaker, Baroness Boothroyd, the first woman Foreign Secretary, who is obviously still in this House, the first female Home Secretary very recently, and indeed, has been mentioned earlier, it is a shame she's not here today, but the first female Sergeant at Arms. I was absolutely delighted to hear when that appointment was made.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, just very briefly, because at the risk of appearing to be rude about my honourable friends on these benches, of course, Lady Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party, voted on almost exclusively by men to become their leader, which I think is an even more considerable achievement if you think about it.
Absolutely. I think the Honourable Lady is certainly quite right on that front. I do intend to draw my remarks to a close fairly shortly, because I know there are many honourable members here that want to make contributions, and I'm keen to hear them. But I would just say that we have made a lot of progress, but there is so much more that we need to do. And one of the things which I think at the moment can be a problem is that while we have our debates and discussions about equality, we can sometimes, I suspect, actually put women off, because there is this feeling out there that this place is an old boys' club, and that it's full of sexism, and that it's a really difficult job to do if you're a woman. And actually, I don't think a lot of that's true, because I think women members of all sides of the House will say this is an absolutely wonderful job. It's very suited to the skill sets of women. It's not all about standing up and making speeches. So much of it is about listening and dealing with constituents' problems and finding ways to work with others of different parties or different agencies within constituencies to get solutions. And indeed, even within this place, there is not anything like the sexism that there used to be. And indeed, it is a very enjoyable thing to do. And I sometimes think we need to make that case more strongly. And in December, I had an exchange with the Secretary of State where I suggested this, and I followed it up with a letter to ask whether or not she thought it would be a good idea to have a cross-party initiative on this issue. And she did respond to me in January. I have to apologise for not responding back yet. I've been somewhat monopolised by the EU bill over the past month. But she said in her letter, it would be good if either myself or the Honourable Member for Stevenage could meet with you to discuss how the parties could work more effectively on this important issue. And I very much welcome that sentiment, and what I would actually hope is that, that rather than just the Right Honourable Lady and the Minister meeting with myself, but that we may also be able to involve the Conservatives in this issue and actually have a cross-party initiative to look at how we collectively sell the job of being a Member of Parliament and make sure that out there in the media the message goes out that this is something which is very enjoyable to do.
Would my honourable friend agree that part of the problem is the image? Part of the problem is the image that this House projects of what the standard MP is. And the image the media give is of a white, male, middle-class man who looks like a stuffed suit. And actually, if your groupings that you have can actually persuade some of the honourable members, the rules of this House, to make men look slightly less so stuffed and starched, it actually might give a different image of what being an MP is.
I would never say that my honourable friend looked like he was a stuffed suit. But certainly I think there is a lot that can be done, and I think that it would be wonderful if from this debate today the message goes out, this is something that women across the country who've got talents to offer should consider, and that we can actually use this as a starting point to work together on this issue. We should celebrate very much the achievements and all the work of women in the past, but also very much look forward to much better representation of women in the future.
Yes.